The NBC Studios in Burbank hummed with the familiar energy of America's most watched late-night television show as Al Pacino adjusted his position in the guest chair beside Johnny Carson's iconic desk. October 23, 1985. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was appointment television for 30 million Americans, and being invited to sit in that chair was both an honor and a potential career-defining moment. At 45, Al had appeared on the show twice before, but tonight felt different. The studio audience of 300 people sat in the darkened bleachers, their attention focused on the brightly lit stage where Carson commanded his television kingdom with the easy confidence of someone who'd been the undisputed king of late night for over 2 decades. The familiar Tonight Show set, the colorful curtain backdrop, Carson's desk with its distinctive wood grain, the guest chairs positioned at the perfect angle for conversation, had become as recognizable to Americans as the White House or the Statue of Liberty. Al wore a navy blue suit with a simple white shirt and dark tie, understated but elegant, the kind of outfit that conveyed respect for the occasion without trying to steal focus from Carson himself. He'd learned early in his television appearances that the key to succeeding on talk shows was understanding that you were a guest in someone else's house, and Johnny Carson's house had very specific rules about how guests were expected to behave. Carson, 60 years old and at the absolute peak of his cultural influence, sat behind his desk in his customary position. Relaxed but alert, friendly but maintaining the subtle distance that reminded everyone that this was his show, his stage, his domain. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit immaculate, his expression carrying that mixture of warmth and mischief that had made him America's favorite television personality. They were 12 minutes into what was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance for AL's latest film, Revolution, a big-budget historical drama that had received mixed reviews but showcased AL's commitment to challenging, unconventional roles. The conversation had been proceeding normally, Carson asking about the film, Al discussing his preparation process, the usual back and forth that filled late-night television with professionally polished entertainment. "You know, Al," Carson said, settling back in his chair with the timing of someone who conducted thousands of these interviews, "I've been watching your career for 15 years now, and I have to say, there's something fascinating about your approach to acting." Al nodded politely, sensing that Carson was building towards something but not yet sure what direction the conversation would take. Carson's interview style was famously unpredictable. He could be supportive and charming one moment, then deliver a cutting observation that left guests scrambling to recover their footing. "You're what they call a method actor, right?" Carson continued, his tone conversational but carrying an undertone that suggested he was setting up something more significant than casual conversation. "I suppose that's one way to describe my approach," Al replied carefully, his experience with interviews having taught him to be cautious when talk show hosts began categorizing his artistic process. Carson leaned forward slightly, his expression taking on the mock-serious quality he used when delivering his most effective comedic material. "Now, help me understand this, because I'm just a simple Nebraska boy who never went to acting school." "Method acting means you become the character completely, right? You live as that person, think like that person, even between takes. It's about finding the psychological truth of the character," Al said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone he used when discussing his craft. "Understanding what drives them, what they fear, what they want. It requires deep preparation and commitment." Carson nodded sagely, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was preparing to shift the tone of the conversation. Deep preparation. Months of research. Complete psychological immersion. "That's right," Al confirmed, though something in Carson's tone was beginning to make him wary. Carson picked up his pencil, a prop he often used when transitioning into comedic material, and began tapping it rhythmically against his desk. "So when you were preparing for Scarface, you spent months learning to be a Cuban drug dealer. When you prepared for Serpico, you rode with police officers. When you prepared for The Godfather, you studied Sicilian culture and organized crime." "Those are simplified descriptions, but essentially accurate," Al replied, recognizing that Carson was building towards something but unable to anticipate what it might be. Carson set down his pencil and looked directly at Al, his expression shifting to something that might have been amusement but felt more like predatory anticipation. "That's a lot of work to learn how to yell HOAH, and look intense." The comment landed like a physical blow. The studio audience laughed, not the polite, supportive laughter that usually accompanied Tonight Show banter, but the kind of surprised, slightly uncomfortable laughter that greeted unexpected cruelty. Al felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his composed expression, knowing that 30 million Americans were watching his reaction. Carson, sensing he had the audience's attention and perhaps emboldened by their response, pressed forward. "I mean, let's be honest here, Al. Whether you're playing a cop, a gangster, or a Revolutionary War soldier, it's basically the same performance, isn't it? A lot of intensity, a lot of yelling, a lot of..." Carson affected an exaggerated Italian-American accent. "Hey, I'm very passionate about this thing." The audience laughed harder now, and Al could see Carson's confidence growing with each chuckle. This wasn't gentle ribbing or affectionate celebrity roasting, this was a direct attack on his artistic credibility, delivered in front of the largest television audience in America. Al's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, tightened slightly. His breathing remained controlled, but something in his posture suggested that Johnny Carson had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "And all this method acting preparation," Carson continued, clearly pleased with the audience's response to his previous comments, "months of research to basically play Al Pacino in different costumes. Must be exhausting, all that work to achieve the same result." Carson gestured theatrically, playing to his audience. "I can see it now." Al Pacino in his hotel room, practicing yelling at different volumes. HOAH. "No, that's too soft." HOAH. "No, that's too loud." HOAH. "There, that's just right for the dramatic moment." The audience was fully with Carson now, laughing at each impression, each exaggerated gesture. Al sat motionless in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving Carson's face, his expression unreadable but his stillness somehow more threatening than any outward display of anger would have been. Carson, perhaps misinterpreting Al's silence as acquiescence or even enjoyment of the routine, decided to escalate further. "You know what I think, Al? I think method acting is just a fancy way of saying you do the same thing over and over again, but you want credit for working really hard at it." The studio had gone very quiet very quickly. Even the audience seemed to sense that something had shifted, that Carson had moved from playful mockery into territory that felt more personal and cruel. Al continued to sit motionless, but there was something building in the silence, something that made Carson's smile flicker slightly. "Johnny," Al said, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the studio's sound system, "can I ask you something?" Carson's expression shifted, perhaps recognizing that his guest was about to respond in a way that wasn't part of the usual talk show script. "Of course, Al. This is your time." Al leaned forward slightly in his chair, his movement controlled but commanding. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality that made everyone in the studio suddenly more alert. "How long have you been doing this show?" Carson looked puzzled by the question. 23 years this December." "Why?" 23 years, Al repeated, his voice thoughtful but carrying an undercurrent that suggested he was building towards something significant. "That's a long time to perfect a single performance." The audience shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that the dynamic in the studio was about to change dramatically. But before Carson could respond, Al was already continuing, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous. But before Carson could respond, Al was already continuing, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous, but controlled and focused in a way that transformed the entire energy of the studio. 23 years of coming out from behind that curtain, sitting at that desk, delivering monologue jokes written by other people, interviewing guests with questions prepared by your staff, and ending every show the same way. Al's voice remained conversational, but there was something underneath it that made Carson lean back slightly in his chair. The audience had gone completely silent, recognizing that something unprecedented was happening. This wasn't the usual flow of Tonight Show conversation. Al Pacino was systematically dismantling Johnny Carson's critique by applying the same logic to Carson's own career. "That's 23 years of essentially the same performance, Johnny," Al continued, his dark eyes never leaving Carson's face. "Same desk, same chair, same rhythm, same charm, same timing. By your definition, wouldn't that make you the ultimate method actor? Playing Johnny Carson every single night for over 2 decades. Carson's famous composure flickered for the first time. He was accustomed to being the one asking pointed questions and delivering cutting observations. Having the tables turned on live television was uncharted territory, and his usual quick wit seemed momentarily stunned. "But that's different, Al," Carson managed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I'm not pretending to be someone else. I'm being myself." Al smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're playing a character called Johnny Carson, America's favorite talk show host. Perfectly groomed, perfectly charming, perfectly safe. Never too controversial, never too real, never anything that might make your audience uncomfortable." The studio was now electric with tension. Camera operators found themselves adjusting their positions slightly, drawn by the magnetic quality Al was projecting. This wasn't just an interview anymore, this was a masterclass in controlled confrontation happening in real time. "You want to talk about doing the same thing over and over again?" Al asked, his voice gaining strength and focus. "Let's talk about your monologue. Every night, same format, topical jokes about politicians, celebrities, current events. Same timing, same delivery, same safe humor that never challenges anyone to think too hard." Al leaned forward in his chair, his presence somehow commanding despite the physical positioning. "Same interview format. Guest walks out, sits in this chair, promotes their project, engages in light banter, gets a laugh from the audience, exits stage left. Same rhythm, same beats, same comfortable predictability that lets 30 million Americans go to sleep feeling entertained but not disturbed." Carson opened his mouth to interrupt, but Al was building momentum now, his voice carrying the kind of passionate conviction that had defined his greatest performances. "You mock my preparation, Johnny, but let me tell you what preparation really means. When I spent months learning to be Frank Serpico, I wasn't just practicing yelling at different volumes. I was learning what it costs a man psychologically to be the only honest person in a corrupt system." Al's voice was gaining power now, not louder but deeper, more resonant, filling the studio with presence that made everyone listening feel like they were witnessing something important. "I rode with undercover narcotics officers in New York, Johnny. I watched deals go bad, I saw people die, I learned what it feels like to know that one wrong word could get you killed. Not because I wanted to show off how hard I was working, but because Frank Serpico demanded that level of truth." The audience was transfixed. This wasn't entertainment anymore, this was an artist defending the core of his life's work against someone who'd reduced it to cheap comedy. "And when I prepared for Michael Corleone," Al continued, his voice taking on a new intensity, "I didn't just learn an Italian accent and practice looking stern. I spent 2 years understanding how a good man becomes a monster through the choices he makes. I learned what it costs psychologically to destroy your soul to protect your family." Al stood from his chair, a movement so unexpected and powerful that Carson instinctively leaned back. Al wasn't threatening. He was transforming the entire dynamic of the studio through sheer presence. "You think that's the same as coming out here every night and delivering the same comfortable performance to the same comfortable audience?" Al asked, looking not just at Carson now but at the cameras, speaking directly to millions of viewers watching at home. "You want to know the difference between what you do and what I do, Johnny? You perform. I transform. You entertain. I explore what it means to be human in circumstances most people never have to face." Al began moving around his chair, his energy electric but controlled, like a professor delivering the most important lecture of his career. "When I played Tony Montana in Scarface, I didn't just practice a Cuban accent and watch gangster movies. I spent months understanding what desperation looks like, what ambition costs, what it means to believe that America owes you everything and to be willing to destroy yourself to take it. Al's voice was building now, carrying the kind of controlled power that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. I lived in Miami, Johnny. I met people who'd escaped Cuba with nothing and built empires through intelligence and violence. I learned what it feels like to be so hungry for success that you'd kill for it. That's not practicing yelling, that's psychological archaeology. Carson sat motionless behind his desk, perhaps recognizing that he'd unleashed something far more powerful than he'd anticipated. The audience was completely silent, watching Al command the stage with an authority that made Carson seem small by comparison. "You mock the intensity, the passion, the commitment," Al said, his voice taking on a different quality now, more intimate but somehow more powerful. "You reduce months of psychological research to HOOAH, jokes because it's easier to make fun of dedication than to understand what it actually requires." Al moved closer to Carson's desk, his presence filling the space between them. "But here's what you don't understand, Johnny. When audiences watch Frank Serpico or Michael Corleone or Tony Montana, they're not seeing Al Pacino yelling in different costumes. They're seeing fully realized human beings with complete psychological histories and emotional realities." Al's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the studio. "And those characters exist because I was willing to risk my sanity, my health, my personal relationships to find the truth of their psychology. Because I understood that great acting isn't about being comfortable or safe or predictable." Al looked directly at Carson, then at the audience, then back at Carson. "Great acting is about being willing to disappear completely into another human being's experience, no matter how dark or dangerous or uncomfortable that experience might be. And if that seems like too much work to you, if that level of commitment seems excessive or pretentious, then maybe the problem isn't with my approach to acting." Al paused, letting his words settle over the studio like a judgment. "Maybe the problem is with an entertainment culture that's become so comfortable with surface-level performance that it can't recognize psychological truth when it sees it." The silence that followed was profound. Carson sat frozen behind his desk, his famous composure completely shattered. The audience remained motionless, perhaps recognizing that they'd witnessed something unprecedented in television history. Al returned to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, his hands resting on its back, his presence undimmed. "You've been doing this show for 23 years, Johnny," Al said, his voice returning to a more conversational tone but retaining its underlying power. "And in all that time, have you ever risked anything real? Have you ever challenged your audience to feel something uncomfortable? Have you ever used your platform to explore what it means to be human instead of just keeping people entertained?" Carson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his television career, Johnny Carson was speechless. "Because that's the difference between what I do and what you do," Al continued. "I risk everything to find truth. You risk nothing to maintain comfort. And right now, 30 million Americans are watching the difference between those two approaches play out in real time." Al looked around the studio, taking in the faces of audience members who were staring at him with a mixture of awe and respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the interview. "So yes, Johnny, I am a method actor. Yes, I spend months preparing for roles. Yes, I disappear completely into the psychology of my characters. And if that threatens you, if that makes you uncomfortable enough to reduce it to comedy routines about yelling, then maybe you should ask yourself why someone else's commitment to their art feels like such a personal attack on your own choices." Al picked up his suit jacket from the back of his chair and slipped it on with deliberate care. "Thank you for having me on your show, Johnny. It's been educational." With that, Al walked off the Tonight Show stage, leaving behind a studio full of people who had just witnessed television history. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds before Carson managed to stammer something about going to commercial break. The phones at NBC began ringing before the commercial break ended. viewers calling to say they'd never seen anything like what had just happened on live television. Entertainment journalists describing it as the most powerful defense of artistic integrity ever broadcast. Acting teachers requesting copies to show students as an example of passionate conviction under pressure. Johnny Carson never made jokes about method acting again. In fact, he rarely mentioned Al Pacino at all, perhaps understanding that their encounter had revealed something about the difference between entertainment and art that he wasn't entirely comfortable confronting. Al never spoke publicly about the Tonight Show appearance, but his career choices in the following years suggested that the exchange had clarified something important about his relationship with critics who didn't understand what he was trying to achieve as an artist. The video became legendary in entertainment circles, passed around before the internet existed through industry contacts and bootleg recordings. It represented something unprecedented. An artist refusing to be diminished on the biggest platform in America, choosing instead to educate the audience about what serious commitment to craft actually meant. Al Pacino's Tonight Show appearance didn't just make television history, it redefined what it meant to defend your artistic vision in front of the largest possible audience, proving that sometimes the most important battles happen not in private but in front of 30 million witnesses.